Now that you know where Nagpra came from and what it improved upon, let's take a look at the law and how it works. Nagpra seeks to protect human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And it seeks to return those same things that are currently held by federal agencies or federally funded museums to their rightful owners. Nagpra is administered by the National Nagpra Program, which is housed in an office in the Department of the Interior. The National Nagpra Program develops regulations and guidance, and provides staff support for the Nagpra Review Committee. It also maintains Nagpra databases, manages a grant program, and provides educational resources. The law itself includes provisions for unclaimed, culturally identifiable Native American cultural items. It addresses the intentional and inadvertent discovery of Native American cultural items on federal and tribal lands. And it provides penalties for noncompliance and illegal trafficking that may arise concerning repatriation under Nagpra. The objects that are protected by the law include human remains, associated and unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. With Nagpra, unlike with ARPA or antiquities, these don't have to be old items to gain protection. For human remains, they must be the physical remains of a Native American. Funerary objects are those objects placed near a person's remains as a part of a death rite or ceremony. Sacred objects are specific ceremonial objects that are needed for the modern-day practice of traditional Native American religions. And objects of cultural patrimony are group-owned objects having ongoing importance to the group. For human remains and associated funerary objects, the remains and objects should be returned to the lineal descendants. These things are clearly very personal to specific individuals. If the lineal descendants aren't able to be identified, then you look at where the remains were discovered. Or if on tribal land, there would be an attempt to determine the closest cultural affiliation. If they're found on federal land, there would be an investigation into which group is recognized as aboriginally occupying the area and who could show the strongest demonstration of relationship. For unassociated funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, it's the same process as for human remains, where the lineal descendants cannot be determined. If on tribal land, there would be an attempt to determine the closest cultural affiliation. If found on federal land, there would be an investigation into which group is recognized as aboriginally occupying the area and who could show the strongest demonstration of relationship. Nagpra also has a process for resolution of ownership of cultural items discovered on tribal or federal lands after 1990 for intentional excavations and for the inadvertent discovery of resources. For intentional excavations on federal or tribal lands, which are supposed to occur for purposes of discovery or study, this is allowed only if the items are excavated pursuant to an ARPA permitted excavation after consultation with the appropriate group. And a plan must be made in advance for the disposition of the objects. If there's an inadvertent discovery, which means there's no plan in place, then if you come across something, work must stop at that site for 30 days so a plan can be made to protect the objects, to consult with the appropriate people, and to make a plan for disposition of what's found. Please take a few minutes to read the text of the statute for this section. Nagpra also has penalties for selling, buying, using for profit, or transporting for sale these protected resources. There can be fines up to $100,000 and imprisonment up to 1 year for the first offense. Subsequent offenses can carry a term of up to 5 years. Nagpra also authorizes grants to help tribes and museums to execute the process of repatriation of resources, and also establishes a repatriation review committee to facilitate this process. Nagpra applies to all federal agencies, and it also applies to all museums, public and private, so long as they get federal funding. Most museums get some kind of federal funding. Now, the Smithsonian has its own act for the repatriation of what's in its possession. Nagpra only specifically applies to federally recognized tribes. But the Nagpra Review Committee has found that there are instances where non-recognized tribes are the appropriate group to repatriate items to. Museums and agencies can consult with these tribes, and if they decide to return the resources to them, they make a request to the review committee proposing the disposition. For competing claims, where there are multiple requests for the repatriation of an item, and after complying with the requirements of the Act, if the agency or museum can't clearly decide who's the most appropriate to return an object to, the agency or museum can keep the item until the different parties agree upon the disposition of the argument is resolved by a court of competent jurisdiction. Further, where a museum repatriates something in good faith, you should know it won't be held liable for claims by an aggrieved party for a breach of fiduciary duty, public trust, or violations of state law. The repatriation process is technically quite simple. Federal agencies and museums identify cultural items in their collections and prepare inventories and summaries of the items. They consult with lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations regarding the identification and cultural affiliation of the cultural items listed in their Nagpra inventories and summaries. They must then notify lineal descendants, Indian tribes, and Native Hawaiian organizations describing cultural items and lineal descendancy or cultural affiliation, and stating that the cultural items may be repatriated. The Secretary of the Interior then has to publish notice in the Federal Register. It can be difficult, however, to go through rather large collections to determine what needs to be repatriated. And it can also be very difficult to determine who the rightful owner is. Now you may wonder, has Nagpra helped? Let's take a look at an example of Nagpra as applied to some Zuni artifacts. These are Zuni war gods. They're cylindrical wooden sculptures created at the winter solstice and at a few other ceremonies that are held to initiate bow priests. 2 clans participate in the creation of these gods, each carving a different one. After they're made, they're given to the bow priest who installs them at 2 shrines that surround Zuni Pueblo. These new gods replace the old ones placed there during previous ceremonies, and the old ones are placed in a pile of retired gods. Retired gods are important to ritual. They're supposed to remain by the shrine and exposed to the natural elements until they disintegrate. The war gods carved by Zuni priests and left to deteriorate in the elements are believed to be living deities and guardians of the tribe. Removal of these structures causes war, violence, and natural disasters. By the late 1970s, so many of these had been stolen that Zuni religious leaders decided to take action. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Indian Resources Section worked with the Interior Department's Solicitor's Office to help recover the Zuni war gods from private dealers, including the estate of Andy Warhol. And museums also had to repatriate these items to Zuni tribes. The New York Times described this recovery effort as a rare story of American Indians getting back what was taken from them. In 1978, the Zuni requested the return of their war gods from the Smithsonian, the Denver Art Museum, and Sotheby's. There was also a tribal resolution that all the war gods must be returned to their shrines. As part of this resolution, the tribal government gave decision-making authority about sacred objects to the religious leaders and allowed the tribal council to negotiate with outsiders. They also sought technical assistance from the Indian Pueblo Legal Services and anthropologists from the Zuni Archaeology Program. These groups helped to define the legal and historic reasons why the objects should be returned. Sotheby's returned the artifacts based on a law making it a criminal act to possess stolen tribal property. The Denver Museum in 1980 returned 3. It took the Smithsonian 9 years to return theirs. This was in part because of the negotiation with the museum to address the entire Zuni collection. The bureaucracy between the museum and the various leaders of the Pueblo, 6 kivas, 12 medicine societies, other clans and priesthoods, all had to have a say in the repatriation process. In 1987, the Smithsonian returned the war gods and tabled discussions about the rest of the collection. By the time Nagpra was passed in 1990, 24 had been returned, all at the expense of the Zuni. Since Nagpra, 54 have been repatriated from 32 private museums and private collectors. All known gods have been returned or are in the process of negotiations. Museums are tasked with coming up a plan to examine their collections for things like these Zuni war gods and to return artifacts. Some museums have voluntarily gone through with the process, others have made it a more complicated process, such as the Brooklyn Museum that requested that the tribes formally answer questions about authenticity, legitimacy of communal ownership, actual theft, and contemporary use and context. Also, some museums have their own anthropologists to respond to requests for repatriation, and others have to consult with the National Nagpra program. Take a few minutes to review the Nagpra programs of a few museums. Are they similar? Are they organized or disorganized? Do you think this is a fair process? The National Nagpra also maintains several online databases designed to provide access to information on a variety of Nagpra-related topics. All of the databases have search capabilities that allow the user to locate specific information. The databases are updated regularly by National Nagpra staff. Additionally, there are grants offered for implementing the Nagpra process. Please take a few minutes to explore the National Nagpra Program website to see what information is available. The most current figures for repatriation were published in 2014. There are still objects that need to be evaluated and repatriated all these years later. As you can see, there have been and still are many problems associated with the protection of Native American heritage resources. From constitutional questions to problems with enforcement, these resources and the people they belong to are underserved by existing laws. It is, however, important that you understand the laws that currently exist, as well as their limitations. Please make sure that you've completed all of the readings and questions associated with this section. Also, don't forget to complete the homework assignment that follows. Thanks for listening.